how does, corruption, public corruption manifest itself? What are its mechanisms? Where if you have power and authority, you can do a number of favors, and you can basically use whatever are your tools to do favors, provide privileges to people rather than treat people equally. For instance, we can describe legislative favors, which is preferential lawmaking. And most of this American discussion, for instance, looks at exactly this. If laws do not, favor some interest groups to the disfavor of others. And basically all legislation should be constantly scrutinized by civil society in order to understand if the laws gives particular benefit to some groups to the detriment of others, right? Now, it is normal that laws benefit some groups. Let's say you pass legislation where you provide help for everyone who is disabled, right? And this law definitely benefits a special group. Now, and this is perfectly normal. What would be abnormal? What would be abnormal if a certain group within the disabled will get a privilege towards the others without any other difference being within this group? Now, a perfect example of preferential legislation is something from my country in Romania, where at a certain point a law was passed saying very clearly these 7 companies benefit from an exception from the law of bankruptcy. That basically means that the 7 companies who are friends with the then prime minister were simply, getting a bailout from government. They were not, the law of bankruptcy did not apply to them. They didn't have to pay their debts. And this is a legislative favor. And in a normal country, this should be criminalized. This first should not happen by sanction of public opinion, and second, people should go to jail. What is another more frequent but very dangerous and insidious way of public corruption is what we call a redistribution favor. Now, what is a redistribution favor? Redistribution favors come out by subsidies or tax bailouts, meaning that certain groups connected with the government, again, we're not talking, for instance, about a gas subsidy for everyone who falls under the income of $50 per month. If such a subsidy is proposed in the electoral program of a party, it is voted by people and resources exist for it, this is a perfectly legitimate subsidy. And there is no connection between this group of actually very poor people and the government. Governments exist to redistribute money. This is part of the definition of government and politics. What is wrong is when the public allocation, this redistribution of money, follows some particular connection. Connection is the key word. Connection between those who grant the subsidy and those who receive the subsidy, or the tax bailout, or the exception from the bankruptcy law, or whatever. The third kind of very important favoritism, corruption which exists, is what we call public contract favor. A lot of money is distributed by government simply by commissioning public works. Government need the private sector to execute certain things. Let's say you need to buy paper or you need to build a road. There are a variety of things which are very legitimate that the government orders from the public sector. Now, what is the normal here? The normal here is that the government should strive to have competitive procurement in order to get the best value for money for the citizens who pay for the service. But what happens more often than not is that governments do not do this. And corrupt governments tend to give most of public contracts to their cronies, or sometimes even directly their families, which actually leads to very poor quality of service, because the market then becomes concentrated between a few favorite firms who know that whatever they do, they will get the contracts, and therefore they do not bother to provide a good quality of service, right? And costs tend to be very high. Costs tend to be very high for the population simply because, again, where there is no competition, you have poor quality and very high costs. And also, you distort the market very much. A lot of companies would not develop, let's say in IT, where generally, government investment in research is essential for IT business, because simply the whole IT market is captured by a few companies which are well connected to the government and who get these rents, these contracts, these permanent contracts, and they deliver, let's say, very poor software for, traffic management for flights, or poor software for health management systems, or whatever else. Finally, and more frequently, and what citizens encounter more frequently, the other tool by which public corruption manifests itself is the administrative favor. An administrative favor is simply an abuse of any administrative act by the way it is given or simply by the way it is withheld. For instance, hiring in the public sector. This is a really, really large area for public corruption. Jobs in the public sector tend to be very much desired by people, not because they're very well paid. In some countries they are, in other countries they're not, but because they offer security. And therefore you will discover that in corrupt countries, in fact, jobs in the public sector are only accessible through connections, through people who make the hirings in the public sector, instead of being based on merit, on some competition of getting the most qualified people out of, administrative schools or management schools or economic schools, right? But administrative favor is not just hirings, although this is quite an important source of spoils that people who are in government distribute to their cronies, but also, for instance, through concessions. Governments don't always do public contracts. Sometimes they just give a private entrepreneur the right to do something, let's say the right to mine or the right to build or something like this. And this can also be attributed on the basis of favoritism, and this frequently happens. Also within administrative favors, or in fact it's the opposite, administrative discrimination, we can count the controls, right? Controlling for standards. It's quite an important part of government activity. And it's very important that controls are proportionate and that controls are fair, treating everybody similarly. Let's say all the restaurants, right? All restaurants have to have some sort of sanitation license to know that you're not going to get sick eating in that restaurant. And one has to trust the government that this kind of licenses are distributed objectively, right? But if there are some owners of restaurants who have favors and others who do not, or also if controlled people are poorly paid and they only extort from restaurant businesses, they just get around and said, I could close you down, why don't you pay me a bribe? Then it's really very problematic and very corrupt, and that's also something which happens quite frequently.